This story is fictional, but for many it reflects a very real journey. Maybe you know someone like Brian, or perhaps you see a bit of Brian in yourself. Living with ADHD, or supporting someone who does, comes with challenges that can feel overwhelming. This isn't a guide or a solution, but rather a story of recognition. You're not alone in navigating ADHD, whether it's part of your own life or the life of someone you care about. And while every journey is unique, there's always hope in knowing that understanding and growth are possible. Chapter 1. A Day in the Life. The alarm screeched like a fire drill, and Brian groaned, slapping at his phone until it fell silent. He rolled over, eyes half open, to see the numbers on the clock glowing bright red. 8:30 a.m. His heart sank. Work started at 8. Again. He leapt out of bed, tripping over the mountain of clothes he'd been meaning to put away since last Thursday. His uniform shirt was somewhere in the chaos, but after a frantic search, he gave up and grabbed the least wrinkled t-shirt he could find. While brushing his teeth, he opened the fridge to grab a drink, only to find his car keys sitting innocently beside the orange juice. "Really? Again?" he muttered, yanking them out and slamming the fridge door shut. By the time he screeched into the cafe parking lot, he was 45 minutes late, his boss waiting by the door, arms crossed. "Brian, this is the third time this week. Traffic, right?" Yeah, traffic." His voice trailed off as her eyebrows rose. She didn't need to say anything else. He slunk past her into the kitchen, mumbling, "I'll make it up at lunch rush." Lunch rush was a disaster. Brian fumbled orders, spilling a tray of cappuccinos that splattered like a caffeinated Jackson Pollock painting across the floor. A customer complained about her sandwich being cold, and Brian, unable to stop himself, joked, "Guess that's a sign to try the soup, huh?" The glare from his boss could have melted steel. By the end of his shift, she pulled him aside and said, "Take a couple of days off. We'll reassess next week." Reassess. Brian knew what that meant. When he got home, his mum was folding laundry with that tight-lipped look that screamed, "I'm holding it together, but not for long." His dad sat at the table, flipping through the paper. Neither of them said anything as Brian breezed past, heading straight for his room. "Brian, we need to talk," his mum called after him. "Not now," he snapped, slamming the door behind him. He dropped into his gaming chair, shoving aside an empty packet of chips to reach his controller. Within seconds, the familiar chaos of Fortnite filled the screen. The tension of the day began to fade as he geared up his avatar and parachuted onto the map. Here, he wasn't the guy who couldn't get his act together. He was a sniper king, a builder extraordinaire. A message pinged on his screen. "Alison, want to squad up?" A grin spread across his face as he typed back, "Always, let's do this." Alison's voice came through his headset, warm and upbeat. "Hey Brian, how's it going?" "Great," he lied, launching into an exaggerated story about his cafe mishaps. She laughed, the kind of laugh that made him forget how much of a disaster his day had been. They played for hours, chatting and joking like old friends. Alison was the one person who made him feel normal. Better than normal, even. As the night stretched on, he leaned back in his chair, staring at her avatar on the screen. "Maybe she's the one," he muttered to himself, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. But then, doubt crept in, as it always did. He glanced around his messy room, at the pile of unopened mail on his desk, at the clock flashing 2 a.m. He was 21 and still living at home. What could someone like Alison possibly see in him? With a sigh, he shut off the game and lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The day had been chaos. Tomorrow would probably be the same, but for now, at least, he had Alison. Chapter 2. The Parental Battlefield. Brian woke to the sound of his mum's voice filtering in from downstairs. She was on the phone, speaking in that soft, careful tone he knew too well, the one she reserved for important calls. His dad was already up, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, the usual frown creasing his forehead. The tension in the house felt thick this morning, like something was brewing just under the surface. Brian stretched, glancing at the clock. He was late again, but it didn't matter. He hadn't been fired, not yet, but the way his boss looked at him after every slip-up made it feel like an inevitability. He yanked on his clothes and trudged downstairs. "Morning," he mumbled, grabbing a slice of toast from the counter. His mum hung up the phone, her expression already tense. "Brian, we need to talk about the job situation." His stomach dropped. Not again. His dad let out a sigh, lowering the newspaper. "Your mum spoke to her sister last night. She says your cousin's cafe is looking for help. Maybe you should give it a try." Brian froze mid-bite, the toast hanging between his fingers. "I'm fine where I am," he muttered. His dad's voice hardened. "You don't seem fine. You've lost how many jobs now?" Brian's face flushed. "I told you, it's not my fault. The boss just doesn't get me." His mum jumped in before the argument could escalate. "We're just trying to help, Brian. We want to see you succeed." Brian shoved the toast into his mouth, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The truth was, he hated how much his parents tried to fix things for him. Their help always came with a reminder that he wasn't quite cut out for adult life. And when things went wrong, like the cafe incident, he could feel their disappointment like a weight in his chest. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low, pushing past them both. "I don't need your help." His mum stood frozen, her eyes wide with surprise, but Brian didn't wait around to see her reaction. He stomped back upstairs, slamming the door behind him. The room felt stifling, as if his parents' voices were trapped inside the walls with him. He flopped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. Why couldn't they just trust him? He was trying, kind of. But they didn't understand. He wanted to scream, to tell them how hard it was, how impossible it felt to get anything right. But he couldn't. He didn't know how to explain the constant feeling of overwhelm that plagued him. It wasn't like he wanted to mess up. He didn't want to be late all the time or lose another job. But the days blurred into one, and suddenly it was too late, and everything felt like too much. He reached for his phone and, without thinking, tapped open the Fortnite app. A quick escape, just for a minute. As he loaded into a match, the familiar voice of Alison pinged in his headset. "Hey, Brian, you up for some duo action?" "Always," he replied, trying to sound upbeat. He just needed a moment to breathe, to forget about the fight. But the moment he clicked into the game, he felt his mood shift. The adrenaline kicked in as he dropped into the game, his focus narrowing. For the next few minutes, it was just him and Alison, battling their way through Fortnite like they always did. The world outside his screen disappeared. As the match progressed, Brian's mind started to wander. The words his parents had said, the disappointment in their eyes, it all felt like too much. Alison's voice snapped him back to the present. "Hey, you there?" "Yeah, sorry," Brian muttered, shaking off the lingering thoughts. "You sure you're good?" she asked, her tone softer now. He hesitated. She didn't know him like his parents did. She didn't know how hard it was to keep everything together. "I'm fine," he said, gritting his teeth as he focused back on the screen. He didn't want to talk about it. Not yet. Chapter 3, Friendships on the Edge. Brian hadn't seen his best mate Luke in a few days. Luke was one of the few people who actually got him, at least most of the time. They'd been friends since primary school, their bond cemented over countless gaming sessions and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. Luke knew about Brian's ADHD, his tendency to flip between interests, forget commitments, and say things without thinking, and Luke never judged him for it, at least not openly. So when Brian got a text from him, he jumped at the chance to hang out. "Want to grab a beer?" "Sounds good. What time?" "8-ish. Meet at the pub?" It was a plan. Brian texted back a quick sure, not bothering to ask what they'd be talking about or what was on Luke's mind. It didn't matter. Everything always felt easy with him. By 8:30, Brian was standing outside the pub, tapping his phone impatiently. Luke was never this late. Did I get the time wrong? He wondered, looking at the screen again. Just then, Luke's car pulled into the parking lot, screeching to a halt next to him. Luke stepped out, his expression tight and guarded. "Hey, man," Brian greeted, trying to shake off the unease bubbling up. "Yeah, hey," Luke said, barely looking him in the eye. He immediately started walking toward the entrance, leaving Brian to trail behind him. Inside, they ordered beers, and for a while, things were normal. They talked about the usual, old school days, new games, random stuff. Brian relaxed, feeling like he was back in his element. But then Luke's tone shifted. "Hey, Brian," Luke started, leaning in a bit closer. "I've got a proposition for you." Brian frowned. What kind of proposition? I'm in a bit of a bind. You know how I'm trying to get the car repaired, right? Luke asked. Well, I just need a little help covering the cost. Think you could lend me some cash for a couple of weeks? Brian blinked. I'm not sure, man. I don't have much right now, you know that? Come on, Luke said, his voice turning persuasive. You've got a bit saved up, right? It's just a few $100, and I'll pay you back when I get paid. Promise. Brian hesitated. Something didn't sit right, but Luke's pleading eyes, the way he seemed so earnest, made it hard to say no. He always found it hard to say no. I guess I could, but I'm not sure I have that much to spare, Brian said slowly. Luke leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Look, I know things have been tough for you lately. I'm just asking for a little help. You're my mate, right? You'd do it for me, wouldn't you? Brian felt a rush of guilt and confusion. Of course, he would do it for Luke. He always helped his friends, always tried to be the good guy. Okay, he finally said, his voice small. I'll do it, but just this once, all right? Luke grinned, slapping him on the back. That's my mate. You won't regret it. But the next day, when Brian checked his bank balance, his stomach dropped. The money had been transferred, and now he was left with barely anything. Luke hadn't texted him, hadn't mentioned it since. Brian waited for the promise of repayment to materialize, but it didn't. Days passed. A week. No word from Luke. Brian sent a couple of texts, casual at first, but when there was still no response, doubt started to gnaw at him. Did I get played? He texted Luke again, this time blunt. When are you paying me back? Nothing. Brian's heart sank as he realized Luke wasn't just blowing him off, he was avoiding him. The friendship, which had once felt solid, now felt shaky. A week later, he ran into Luke at the pub again. Luke didn't acknowledge him at first, but Brian wasn't going to let it slide. Luke, we need to talk, Brian said, approaching him as he sat at the bar. Luke glanced up, his expression unreadable. What's up? Where's the money, mate? Brian asked, the frustration leaking into his voice. You promised you'd pay me back. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't have it yet, all right? I'll get it to you when I can. Just give me some time. Brian's pulse quickened, a hot flush of anger spreading through his chest. It's been over a week. You said you needed help, but now you're just ignoring me? Luke let out a frustrated sigh, glancing around the room before meeting Brian's eyes. It's not that simple, all right? I'm in a tough spot. I've got other things going on. Brian shook his head, feeling his anger bubble to the surface. Yeah, I get it. You've got other things going on. But you can't just treat me like I don't matter, Luke. That's not how this works. Luke stared at him for a long moment, then mumbled, Whatever, man. It's not that big of a deal. Brian turned away, feeling like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He knew Luke was never the most reliable, but this was different. He'd been used, manipulated into helping with a promise that was never going to be kept. As he left the bar, his stomach churned. The money was gone, and so, it seemed, was a piece of his trust in the people he'd thought were his friends. Sitting in his car, he let out a shaky breath. How did it always end up like this? He felt embarrassed, stupid, even, for being so easily swayed. It wasn't just the money. It was the sting of betrayal, of realizing that someone who called themselves his friend could manipulate him like that. He'd been so eager to help, to be needed, that he hadn't seen the trap until it was too late. And in that moment, Brian's self-esteem took another hit. He felt like a fool. A big, stupid, gullible fool who couldn't even trust his own judgment. Chapter 4. Job Troubles. Brian stood in front of the office door, his heart pounding. He wasn't late for once, but he had that sinking feeling, the feeling he always got before something went wrong. The fluorescent lights above buzzed as he entered the small office, nodding to his co-workers as he passed by. He tried to act casual, like he hadn't just spent the last 5 minutes pacing outside, psyching himself up. It had been a couple of weeks since he'd started the job at the local hardware store, and while it seemed like a simple enough gig, he could already feel the tension building. It wasn't that he didn't like the work. In fact, Brian loved the idea of helping customers find what they needed. The problem was, his brain constantly bounced around. He'd find himself talking to a customer about paint colors one moment, then getting distracted by the sale signs and forgetting where he left his pen the next. One morning, he'd ended up holding a conversation with the store manager about the new inventory, except halfway through, Brian had gotten distracted by a flashy display in the corner of the room, and by the time he'd refocused, he'd lost track of what they were even talking about. "Brian?" The manager's voice snapped him back to the present. "You there?" Yeah, sorry," Brian said, rubbing his forehead. He was already feeling the pressure to perform, but his thoughts were everywhere. He knew he should have been better at this. He wanted to be better. But his mind kept jumping from one task to another, never staying still long enough to focus. The day continued in the same chaotic rhythm. As customers came in, Brian tried to help as best as he could, but it was hard to stay on track. One customer wanted gardening tools, so he led them to the garden section. But while they were looking around, Brian's attention shifted. He caught sight of a new shipment of DIY kits on display, and before he knew it, he was asking the manager about those instead of checking in with the customer. "Brian," the manager's voice was sharp now, "you've got to stay on top of your duties. You can't keep losing focus like this." Brian nodded, but didn't say anything. He could feel the embarrassment crawling up his neck. Of course, he thought. It's always me. Always. Can't even keep my head straight for 5 minutes. By the time lunchtime rolled around, Brian was mentally exhausted. His mind was still racing through all the things he hadn't completed and all the things he should have done differently. As he sat in the break room, his hands tapped against the table in a rhythmic beat, his leg bouncing up and down as he struggled to keep still. He checked his phone, his thoughts racing again. He'd sent a message to Alison earlier, and there was a notification waiting for him. It was something, anything to distract him for a moment. "Hey Brian, hope your day's going all right. How's work?" He quickly typed back, his fingers flying across the screen. Same old, just busy as usual. You know how it is. A little impulse to reach out, to feel connected, to feel like he mattered to someone. But as soon as he hit send, his thoughts shifted again. What if she was busy? What if she didn't care? What if she was just being polite? He shut off the phone and put it down with a sigh, returning to the break room's stale, quiet atmosphere. But then, an unexpected knock on the door caught his attention. It was his manager. "Brian, we need to talk," the manager said, stepping inside with a grim look on his face. "I'm afraid I have to let you go. Your performance isn't where it needs to be." Brian's stomach dropped. "What? But I've been trying. I really have." The manager sighed, crossing his arms. "It's not just that, Brian. You're not staying focused. You're not following through on tasks, and honestly, it's becoming a liability for the team. We need someone who can manage time better and handle tasks without needing constant reminders." Brian's mind was reeling. Not again. Not this. He couldn't even keep a simple job. How was it always his fault? Why couldn't he just do it right for once? "I'm sorry," the manager said, stepping back toward the door. "We can give you a reference if you need one, but we can't keep you on anymore." The door clicked shut behind him, and Brian sat there in stunned silence. This always happens. Why does it always happen? For a while, he just sat there, unable to move. His mind replayed every mistake, the distracted conversations, the missed tasks, the moments where his attention had shifted to something else, leaving people frustrated and confused. "It's not me," he wanted to tell himself. "It's not my fault. It's the job. It's the people around me. They don't understand." Brian's fists clenched as he tried to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to spill over. They don't get it. They don't get how hard it is to just focus. It's not that I don't want to. I do. I try. I just can't make it work. He grabbed his bag, his heart still hammering in his chest. The walk back to the car was mechanical, each step heavy as if his feet were made of lead. He sat in the driver's seat, staring out of the windshield. How do I keep doing this? He leaned his head back against the headrest, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He had to admit it. He was failing. Again. And no matter how hard he tried to blame the job, the manager, the world around him, deep down he knew it was him. He just couldn't do it right. And yet, the thought of acknowledging his ADHD, of actually confronting it, was too terrifying. If he admitted it, what would that mean for his future? Would he be a failure forever? Would he always be stuck in this cycle? As the day dragged on, Brian's self-doubt gnawed at him. and he realized the truth he wasn't ready to face. His ADHD wasn't something he could escape. It wasn't something he could blame others for anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending he could handle everything on his own. But that thought left him more lost than ever. Chapter 5: Escaping Online. The soft hum of the Xbox echoed through Brian's room, the glow of the TV screen lighting up his face in sharp contrast to the dark shadows that filled the corners. His room was a mess, cluttered with old game cases, empty cans of soda, and pizza boxes that had piled up over the past week. But right now, none of that mattered. The game was loading, and his mind was already shifting into a different world. Fortnite was his escape. The chaos of the outside world, the pressures from his family, the constant feeling that he was just about to fail, all faded away when he hit start. The world on the screen was clear, ordered, and predictable. No one expected anything from him here. The rules were simple: survive, outlast, and keep playing. He pulled on his headset, the familiar weight of it settling over his ears. With a flick of his thumb, he sent a message to Alison. "You up for some games tonight?" He'd met Alison a few months ago while gaming. They had both been in the same random squad, and it had been an instant connection. Her voice had been calm but confident as they coordinated, each of them picking up the other's slack when the game got intense. Over time, the gaming sessions turned into late-night chats, and those chats in turn became the highlight of Brian's day. "Always ready for the chaos. Let's do it." Brian smiled, feeling the familiar rush of excitement. He booted up the game and loaded into the lobby. The sound of gunshots, explosions, and the rumble of virtual footsteps filled his ears, drowning out the noise of the real world. They joined the same game, and for the next hour, it was like nothing else mattered. Every so often, Alison would send him a message. They'd laugh, share silly memes, and talk about whatever was on their minds. It was easy to talk to her. Unlike in real life, where Brian was always so self-conscious about his weight, his impulsive behavior, his job losses, here he could just be himself. No one cared about his past or his failures, or the way his brain couldn't stay focused on one thing for more than 5 minutes. It was a perfect, safe world. After a while, the game wound down and Brian found himself texting Alison again. "Want to hop on a video call?" "Sure, let's do it." Brian's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done a video call with her in a while. They'd talked over text, shared videos, and even voiced their thoughts, but face-to-face, that was different. He grabbed his phone and set it down on his desk, propping it up against the stack of game cases. His heart beat faster as the camera flickered to life, and Alison's face appeared on the screen. She was smiling, her eyes lighting up the room, and it made Brian's chest tighten with nerves. "Hey there! How's your night going?" Brian rubbed his hand over his hair, trying to smooth it down. His room was dark, and he adjusted the angle of his phone, hoping the shadowed light would hide his face. "Just tired. Been a long day." He didn't mention the job, or the arguments with his parents, or anything that had been making him feel miserable. "I get that. Busy day for me too." They exchanged a few more casual pleasantries, but Brian couldn't help feeling the pressure of being on camera. The way the light hit his face, casting shadows, made him feel like he was hiding something. It was a game he had played with himself over and over, adjusting the lighting, sitting at just the right angle, trying to make himself look smaller. He didn't want Alison to see how much weight he'd gained over the past few months. He didn't want her to see how uncomfortable he was in his own skin. "You look great, by the way. You've got that gamer glow." Brian chuckled, but inside he felt a pang of doubt. Great? She's just saying that. She probably doesn't even mean it. He smiled, but the thought lingered, gnawing at him. "Thanks, you too." The conversation shifted back to the game. Alison mentioned something about a new strategy she'd been trying, and Brian was quick to jump in with his own ideas. They both laughed, arguing about whose tactics were better, but underneath the banter, Brian's mind was preoccupied. He could feel his self-doubt creeping in, like it always did. Was she really into him, or was he just a convenience for late-night chats and gaming sessions? What would happen if they met in real life? Would she see the mess of his life, the things he was trying so hard to hide? The phone call dragged on well into the early hours, but eventually the conversation slowed. Brian could hear the tiredness in Alison's voice, and he knew it was time to wrap up. I should probably get some sleep. Got work tomorrow. Yeah, same here. Let's play again soon, okay? Definitely. They both said their goodbyes, and Brian set his phone down, his fingers lingering over the screen for a moment longer than he needed to. As he shut down his Xbox and crawled into bed, the thoughts swirled around his head. The loneliness that always seemed to follow him in real life was nowhere to be found online. With Alison, he felt seen, but the nagging fear remained. What would happen if she saw the real him? What if he wasn't enough? As he turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep, Brian realized one thing. He was living in two worlds. One where everything felt comfortable and easy, and the other where nothing seemed to go right. And the more he immersed himself in the game, the harder it became to reconcile those worlds. Maybe he could keep the gaming world and Alison as his escape, a refuge from the chaos he couldn't control. But deep down, Brian knew he couldn't stay there forever. Chapter 6. A church group intervention. Brian slouched in the passenger seat of the family car, arms crossed tightly over his chest as the world outside blurred past. He stared at the road ahead, feeling every bump in the pavement. It was Saturday, the day his parents had been talking about all week, the day they insisted he attend the church group event. "You'll enjoy it, Brian," his mum had said this morning, her voice full of that optimism she always had, the kind that made him feel like he was letting her down every time he didn't share her enthusiasm. "It'll be good for you to get out, meet some people. It's about more than just the church, you know." Brian didn't argue. The last thing he wanted was another well-meaning lecture about how getting involved in community things would solve his problems. They had no idea what it was like to be him, to feel like every new attempt to fit in was destined to fail. His dad was driving, his usual quiet presence filling the car, but Brian could feel the unspoken pressure hanging between them. Dad had always been the strong, silent type, the one who'd picked up the slack when Brian couldn't keep a job or focus on his studies. But even Dad was starting to show the cracks, the barely contained frustration that built up in the way he sighed after every failed job interview or Brian's last-minute promise to do better. It didn't matter. Brian was going, whether he wanted to or not. His mum had arranged it, and his dad had given him that look, the kind that meant, "We've tried everything else." When they finally pulled into the church parking lot, Brian could see the congregation already gathering outside. He rolled his eyes, knowing this wasn't going to be anything like the Saturday nights he spent gaming. No, this was a whole other world. "Come on, Brian," his mum urged, already stepping out of the car. "It's just an hour. You'll be glad you came." Brian didn't respond. He wasn't about to argue in front of everyone. He dragged his feet as they walked toward the church doors, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper in his chest with every step. Inside, the warmth of the building enveloped him. The faint smell of incense and the low hum of voices talking over coffee made everything seem too perfect, like they were living in a different reality. Brian felt like an outsider before he even set foot in the room. The church was large, with high ceilings and rows of people sitting in clusters, some with families, others with friends. They all seemed to have a place in this world. They knew how to navigate it. Brian just felt lost. "Take a seat, mate," a guy in his mid-20s waved at him from across the room. "I'll save you a spot." Brian hesitated for a moment, but his mum gave him a gentle nudge toward the seat. "Go on," she whispered. As he sat down, Brian noticed the group of people around him. They were chatting like old friends, laughing over shared experiences. The kind of laughter that stung in his chest because he couldn't remember the last time he had been able to truly laugh without feeling like he was pretending. The event started with a short welcome, and soon they were all settling into their seats. A man in his 40s stood at the front, a warm smile on his face, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Tonight we're going to talk about strength in adversity," the man began. "We all go through tough times, but it's in those moments that we discover what we're truly made of." Brian leaned back in his chair, trying to zone out, but the words lingered in the air, gnawing at him. He shifted uncomfortably. Was that what he needed? To find strength? He wasn't sure he even knew where to start. But then the man spoke again, and this time something in his words caught Brian's attention. Life's not about avoiding the hard moments. It's about how we choose to face them. You don't have to have it all figured out. It's okay to take small steps. The important thing is that you don't stay stuck. Brian's heart raced. Was the guy talking to him? No, of course not. But that line, the important thing is that you don't stay stuck, it felt like it was echoing in his brain. He looked around the room at the faces in the crowd. Everyone seemed so put together. They smiled and nodded as if they understood exactly what the speaker was saying, as if their lives were unfolding as planned, one step at a time. Brian's chest tightened. How could he ever be like them? He was stuck in a cycle of failure, stuck at home with parents who didn't know how to let go, stuck with a job history that had more holes than a Swiss cheese. But then, just as quickly as the thought came, it disappeared. None of us are perfect, the speaker continued. We all have our struggles, but there is always a way forward. And you don't have to do it alone. Brian's eyes flicked up to meet the man's gaze. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about that moment made him feel less invisible. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Brian found himself listening more closely than he'd expected. A few people shared stories of their own struggles, addiction, heartbreak, loss, and how they had found strength and healing. It wasn't easy, but it was real. By the end of the night, the group gathered around in smaller circles to chat. Brian found himself awkwardly standing by the coffee table, unsure of where to go next. One of the women from the event smiled at him and asked if he'd like to join them for some coffee. He nodded, his throat suddenly tight, and sat down with them, though he didn't say much. He wasn't ready to share his story, not yet. But something inside him had shifted, just a little. He could feel it, like the tiniest crack in the wall he had built around himself. The evening ended with everyone exchanging goodbyes and encouraging words, and as Brian left with his parents, the weight he'd carried for so long felt just a bit lighter. "I'm glad you came tonight," his mum said as they climbed back into the car. "See, you're not alone. You've got people." Brian nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to think yet. But as they drove home, his mind replayed that final message. You don't have to stay stuck. Maybe he could move forward. He didn't know how or when or even if it was possible. But for the first time in a long time, Brian felt like he wasn't completely lost. Maybe there was a way out after all. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. Brian sat at the kitchen table, absently pushing his cereal around in a bowl that had long since lost any warmth. His mum was talking again, her voice gentle but persistent, trying to get him to focus. She had that look on her face, the one that told him she was getting tired of repeating herself. "You know, Brian, we can't keep doing everything for you. You're 21 now. It's time you started taking responsibility. You said you were going to get another job this week." She paused, glancing at his dad, who was standing at the counter, silently sipping his coffee. Brian felt his stomach tighten at the unspoken weight between them. "I'm trying, Mum," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. She sighed, clearly not satisfied. "You've been trying for months, but trying isn't enough anymore, Brian. You need to show us that you're actually putting in the effort." Brian felt a flush of irritation rise in his chest. He wasn't lazy, he just couldn't focus. It wasn't as simple as just getting another job. Every time he started something, he'd lose interest, or he'd mess up, or he just didn't care enough to keep going. What was the point? "You know I've been working on it," he snapped, looking up finally. His words were sharp, a little too sharp, but he couldn't help it. "I'm trying to get my head together, okay?" His dad, usually the quiet one, put his cup down with a soft clink. "You keep saying that, Brian, but you're not doing anything. You've lost 3 jobs in the past year. Your mother and I can't keep bailing you out." There was no anger in his voice, just resignation. Brian's stomach twisted again. "I'm not a little kid anymore. You can't keep treating me like I'm 5. "You're not 5, Brian, but you're still acting like you can't take responsibility for your life," his dad said, his tone firmer now. "We've been supportive, but it's time to stop enabling this. If you want to live here, you need to show us that you're trying, really trying." The words cut through him, sharper than he expected. The silent pressure of his parents' expectations had been building for months, but now it was being said out loud. They were tired. And maybe, just maybe, he was too. But it didn't change anything. The idea of trying to change, trying to actually grow up, felt impossible. "You're asking too much," Brian muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I can't do this. I can't. I don't know how." His mum's voice softened, but it only made him feel worse. "We're not asking for perfection, Brian. We're just asking you to try. We're doing everything we can to help you, but we can't keep doing it for you." A cold silence fell over the room, and in that silence, everything he had been avoiding seemed to rise up, pushing him toward the edge. He could feel his chest tightening, his breath quickening. The tightness in his throat was all too familiar, like he was drowning in something he didn't know how to get out of. "I'm not a charity case," he spat out, suddenly standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. His hands clenched into fists and his heart raced. "I'm not a burden." "Brian," his dad started, but it was too late. Brian could feel the familiar surge of panic, the need to escape, to run away. He couldn't stay here. Not in this house, not with this pressure. So he did what he always did when things got too overwhelming. He left. He stormed out the door, ignoring his parents' calls, ignoring their worry. He just had to get away. His legs carried him down the street, his mind spinning with anger and frustration, everything mixing into a blur. His body was on autopilot, moving faster, pushing him away from the world that was closing in on him. He didn't even care where he was going, just as long as he could escape the suffocating pressure of responsibility. Eventually, he found himself at the local pub, the neon sign buzzing in the distance. It was dim inside, the stale smell of beer and cigarettes clinging to the walls. Brian barely noticed the noise, the laughter, or the clinking of glasses. He just walked to the bar, ordered a drink, and downed it in one go. The burn of alcohol slid down his throat, the familiar numbness creeping in. For a few moments, everything slowed. The world felt quieter, more manageable. He wasn't Brian the failure, Brian the burden, Brian who couldn't keep it together. He was just Brian, the guy who could escape for a while. One drink turned into two, then three, and soon he was sitting at the corner of the bar, staring into his empty glass, the edges of his vision blurring. The guilt, the anger, the self-loathing. He tried to bury it all under the fog of alcohol. But it wasn't working like it used to. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He couldn't face the notifications, couldn't handle the disappointment he knew was waiting there. He didn't want to talk to anyone, especially not his parents, who were probably at home waiting for an apology. But he didn't have it in him to apologize. He didn't know how. The evening stretched on, the hours slipping by unnoticed as Brian sank deeper into avoidance. He wasn't going home. Not tonight. Not when he couldn't even fix what was broken inside of him. The more he drank, the more he felt like he was burying the real issue, his failure to take responsibility, his fear of failure, and his inability to change. When the bar finally started to close, Brian stumbled out, his thoughts a muddled mess, his steps unsteady. He didn't care. He didn't care about anything anymore. He just needed to keep going, away from the house, away from the expectations, away from everything. The cold night air hit him hard as he stepped onto the sidewalk, but it did little to clear the fog in his mind. His phone buzzed again, and this time he looked at it. A message from Alison. She had been asking if he was okay, if he wanted to play Fortnite. It was a fleeting moment of connection, but in his current state, he couldn't even muster the energy to respond. So he slipped the phone back into his pocket and wandered aimlessly down the street, knowing that the real problem, his problem, would still be waiting for him when the night was over. Chapter 8, a wake-up call. Brian sat on the worn couch in his friend Dave's living room, a drink in hand, though he wasn't really paying attention to it anymore. It had been a few days since the argument with his parents, and everything still felt heavy. The fight had left a gaping silence in his house, but even more so in his mind. The alcohol had numbed things temporarily, but now it was just him and the weight of everything crashing down on him, just like the last time. "Man, you're quiet tonight," Dave said, looking up from his phone where he'd been scrolling absent-mindedly. He was one of Brian's closest friends, the type who understood his quirks, tolerated his impulsive decisions, and still stuck around. They'd known each other since high school, though they hadn't been this close in a long time. There was a comfort in Dave's straightforwardness, the kind that cut through Brian's typical defenses, and tonight, Brian couldn't seem to hide anything from him. "Yeah, just a lot," Brian muttered, staring into his drink. His voice was thick, but the words felt like lead in his chest. Dave leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You want to talk about it? 'Cause it's obvious something's been eating at you for a while now." Brian hesitated. He wasn't used to being this open. He wasn't sure how to explain everything, the frustration with himself, the tension with his family, the sense that he was failing at life while everyone else seemed to have it together. And then there was Alison. He couldn't even bring himself to talk to her, the girl he liked, for fear of messing up somehow. Everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "I don't even know where to start," Brian said, finally meeting Dave's gaze. "I feel like I'm stuck, like nothing I do ever works out. And now my parents are done with me. I don't know what to do, man." Dave nodded, a sympathetic look crossing his face. "I get it, dude. I've been there. Not with your situation, but I get it. We all have our things." He paused, his expression shifting into something a bit more serious. "I don't know if I ever told you, but I've been dealing with my own struggles. Not ADHD like you, but anxiety, man. It's been tough, like crippling tough. I had days where I couldn't even leave my house, and I'd get stuck in this cycle of feeling like I was worthless." Brian blinked, taken aback. Dave had always been the laid-back guy, the one who kept things light and easy. Hearing him talk about something like anxiety, something real, felt strange, but in a way comforting. "You? But you always seem so calm," Brian said, a little unsure, though his curiosity was piqued. Dave chuckled dryly. "Yeah, well, that's the mask, right? I spent years pretending I had everything together, but inside, it was a mess. I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten until one day I was so exhausted from pretending, I just collapsed. I had to face it. And the hardest part wasn't the struggle itself, it was accepting it. Once I admitted I had a problem, that's when I could start getting better." Brian listened intently, the weight of his own frustration suddenly feeling a little lighter, like someone had cracked open a window to let the stale air out. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe you need to admit what's going on, man. I've seen you struggle with focus, the impulsivity, the way you keep bouncing from one thing to the next without finishing it. I've heard you talk about it before, but you always brush it off like it's nothing. You don't even seem to recognize how much it's affecting you and how it's affecting everyone around you." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What, like, you think I should just admit that I'm broken? That I can't fix anything?" No, Dave said quickly, holding up a hand. "That's not it at all. I'm saying maybe you need to stop pretending you don't have this thing. It's okay to have ADHD, man. It doesn't make you broken. But not acknowledging it, that's when things start falling apart. Maybe getting help, really getting serious about it, is the first step." Brian let Dave's words settle over him, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't that he hadn't heard it before. His parents had suggested it, even his old therapist had mentioned it. But hearing it from someone who didn't have any hidden agenda, who wasn't trying to fix him, made it feel a little less like a diagnosis and more like a reality he could face. "I don't know. I've been avoiding it," Brian admitted, his voice quieter now. "I guess I don't want to think that there's something wrong with me." Dave looked at him with a mix of concern and understanding. "There's nothing wrong with you, Brian. It's just a part of you. I mean, yeah, it might make life harder sometimes, but it doesn't mean you can't work through it. It doesn't make you any less of a person." Brian thought about it for a long moment, the weight of it all sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely isolated. He wasn't the only one struggling with something real. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve pretending to be someone he wasn't. "I don't know where to start," Brian said after a pause. "That's the hardest part, man. But if you want to start somewhere, maybe just talk to someone about it. Get a proper diagnosis. I mean, there's no shame in that, right?" Brian nodded slowly. The thought of getting diagnosed, facing everything head-on, was terrifying. But somehow Dave's words made it seem more like a choice he could make, not a forced decision. "Thanks, Dave," Brian said quietly. "I don't think I would have been able to think about this if you hadn't said something." Dave smiled, his usual easy grin returning. "That's what friends are for, man. Just don't make me do all the heavy lifting, all right?" For the first time in a long while, Brian let himself laugh. It felt strange, but good. There was still so much to figure out, so much to work through, but for the first time he didn't feel so alone in it. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it was about starting with one small step. And for now, that small step was admitting that maybe, just maybe, he had a little more work to do than he realized. But that didn't mean it was the end. Chapter 9. Steps Toward Change. The early mornings were the hardest. Brian's alarm buzzed, cutting through the quiet darkness of his room, and he reached out blindly to slap it off. His bed was warm, the covers comforting, but his mind already started churning with the tasks of the day. Normally, he'd ignore the alarm for another half hour, or even longer, but today was different. Today he was trying. It hadn't been easy. The night before, after pacing around his room and avoiding his parents, he had sat down at his desk armed with a blank notebook and a pen. He'd scrawled out a basic plan. Wake up at a reasonable time, take a shower, make breakfast, get dressed, not just stay in his pajamas all day. Simple stuff. Stuff other people did without thinking, but for him it felt monumental. He'd set up his phone with a calendar app to help keep him on track. A visual reminder, something he could check throughout the day. He even added small tasks like drinking water and stretching his legs to avoid spending the entire day on the couch. Small steps, he thought, could lead to bigger ones. But limiting the alcohol? That felt like an impossible task. It had been his way of numbing the constant noise in his head, the guilt, the fear of being judged. But lately, it wasn't working anymore. The hangovers lasted longer, and the escape didn't feel like escape at all. Today, he promised himself there wouldn't be any alcohol, not until the evening at least. By mid-morning, the shift in routine hit hard. Brian sat at the kitchen table, holding his coffee mug with both hands, staring out the window at the quiet street. It wasn't just the booze that had been his crutch. It was the feeling of doing nothing, of letting the hours pass so he didn't have to face anything. The doorbell rang suddenly, jolting him from his thoughts. He opened the door to find his mum holding a bag of groceries, smiling brightly despite the tension that had been hanging over them for weeks. "Hey, love," she said, stepping inside. "Got the things you asked for." Brian managed a faint smile. "Thanks, Mum." She set the bag down on the counter, her eyes scanning the room as if checking for signs of progress. "How's it going today? You doing all right?" "Better, I guess," Brian muttered, glancing at his phone. His therapist appointment reminder flashed on the screen, and he felt a pang of dread. His mum nodded, her expression softening. "Good. I can see you're trying, Brian, and that's all we want, to see you trying." Brian nodded, but the words hit differently than she might have intended. He knew she was being supportive, but it still felt like a reminder of how far he had to go. Later that night, after dinner, Brian settled into his usual gaming session. He powered on his Xbox and loaded up Fortnite, the familiar sounds of the game filling the room. As always, Alison was online, and the sight of her gamertag brought a small smile to his face. "Hey Brian, ready to get carried again?" Alison's voice came through the headset, her tone playful. "Carried? Please, I'm the MVP," he shot back, leaning into the banter. The game started and they slipped into their usual rhythm, but tonight felt different. Alison's light-hearted teasing had a way of putting him at ease, and the game became less about winning and more about just being present. "You seem more focused tonight," Alison said during a break between matches. "Everything all right over there?" Brian hesitated. Normally, he'd brush off a question like that with a joke or a quick, "Yeah, all good," but something about her tone made him pause. "I've been trying to sort things out," he admitted finally. "My parents are on my case, and I've been messing things up left and right. Feels like I'm always the problem." "Brian, you're not a problem," Alison said, her voice steady but gentle. "You're a person who's figuring things out, like everyone else. Cut yourself some slack." He laughed nervously, shifting in his chair. It's not that easy. I don't want people to see how much I'm struggling. I keep trying to be, I don't know, normal, I guess, like everyone else." "Normal is overrated," Alison said, her tone lighter now. "You don't need to be like everyone else. You just need to be you. And you're doing that, even if you don't see it yet." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket, and for the first time in a long time he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Alison was right. Maybe he didn't need to be normal. Maybe just trying, little by little, was enough. That night, after their call ended, Brian sat in the dim light of his room, the quiet hum of his Xbox filling the space. He wasn't sure what the next day would bring, but he felt different. The shame and doubt were still there, but they didn't feel as heavy. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 10. Meeting her. Brian sat in the driver's seat of his old sedan, gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He stared out at the small cafe nestled beside the highway, its faded sign swaying gently in the breeze. This was it. The first time he'd meet Alison in person. The idea had come up during one of their late-night chats a few weeks ago. She'd suggested meeting halfway between her town and his, a neutral ground that felt safe for both of them. Brian had agreed, fueled by a mix of excitement and sheer terror. Now that he was here, every ounce of confidence he'd built was rapidly dissolving. He tugged at the hem of his shirt, wishing he'd picked something less wrinkled. Less, "I threw this on 5 minutes ago." The faint scent of car air freshener did little to mask his nerves. He glanced at the cafe again and spotted her. Alison stood near the entrance, her phone in one hand as she looked around. She was wearing a light denim jacket over a floral dress, her hair swept to one side. She looked just like she did on video calls, only more real. Brian took a deep breath, ran a hand through his hair and stepped out of the car. His legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to cross the parking lot. "Alison?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. She turned and smiled, her face lighting up in a way that made his heart do a strange little flip. "Brian!" Her enthusiasm caught him off guard, and for a moment he just stood there, unsure whether to go for a handshake, a hug, or nothing. Alison seemed to sense his hesitation and closed the gap herself, pulling him into a quick, friendly hug. "Good to finally meet you in person," she said, her voice as warm as it was over the phone. "You too," Brian managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Inside the cafe, they settled into a small booth by the window. Brian fidgeted with the edge of the menu, trying not to overthink everything. What if he said something stupid? What if she noticed his hands shaking? What if... "Relax," Alison said, as if reading his mind. "It's just me." He laughed nervously. "Yeah, sorry, I'm just not great at this kind of thing." "You're doing fine," she assured him. The conversation started slow, like a car sputtering to life on a cold morning. They talked about the weather, the drive, the cafe's surprisingly eclectic menu. But as the minutes passed, Brian found himself easing into the rhythm of it. Alison had a way of putting him at ease, her laughter softening the edges of his self-doubt. By the time they'd finished their sandwiches and were sharing a slice of cheesecake, Brian was laughing along with her, the awkwardness of earlier forgotten. "So," Alison said, leaning back in her chair, "are you glad we did this?" Brian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." Her smile widened. "Good, because I was starting to think I'd have to come all the way to your town to drag you out of your cave." He chuckled, the sound genuine this time. "Wouldn't have blamed you. I'm pretty good at hiding." "Well, maybe you don't need to," she said, her tone turning serious. "You're not as bad at this as you think, you know." Something in her words hit him deeply, a warmth spreading through his chest. For so long, he'd felt the need to mask parts of himself, to shield others from his chaos. But here Alison was, seeing him as he was, and not running for the hills. As they walked back to their cars, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, Brian felt lighter than he had in months. "Drive safe," Alison said, giving him a quick wave before climbing into her car. "You too," he called back, watching as her car disappeared onto the highway. As he slid into his own car, Brian couldn't help but smile. Meeting Alison wasn't just a success, it was a turning point. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to hide who he was. Chapter 11. Rebuilding Relationships. The familiar creak of the front door greeted Brian as he stepped into the house. It was late afternoon, and the warm smell of his mum's roast chicken wafted from the kitchen. He paused in the hallway, staring at the floorboards that had seen countless arguments, silences, and uneasy truces over the years. "Brian, is that you?" His mum's voice called from the kitchen. "Yeah, Mum," he replied, hesitating before walking through. He found her at the counter, peeling carrots with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She glanced up briefly, her expression neutral but her eyes softening. "Dinner'll be ready soon. You hungry?" "Yeah," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Can we talk first?" She stopped mid-peel, setting the carrot and peeler down. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Brian shifted uncomfortably, the words catching in his throat. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. The yelling, the job stuff, just all of it." His mum's shoulders relaxed and she let out a slow breath. "That means a lot, Brian, really." He nodded, his gaze fixed on a spot on the table. "I know I've been a lot to deal with, and I don't blame you for being frustrated. I didn't realize how much I was taking advantage of you and Dad." She walked over and placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "We love you, Brian. We always will. But we can't keep carrying you. You have to start carrying yourself, even if it's hard." He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded again. "I'm trying. I really am." Later that evening, after dinner, Brian found his dad in the garage tinkering with an old lawnmower. His dad looked up as Brian entered, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something wrong with your car?" "No, it's fine," Brian said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything you've done for me, and sorry for all the crap I've put you through." His dad set the rag down, studying him for a moment. "You've had a rough go, mate, but you've got to take responsibility now. No one else can do it for you." "I know," Brian said. "I'm working on it." His dad clapped a hand on his shoulder, a small but significant gesture. "That's all we want to hear." Rebuilding trust with his friends was trickier. Over the years, they'd been his safety net, but he'd tested their patience more times than he could count. One Friday evening, he met up with his closest mate, Sam, at their usual spot, a park bench near the local footy field. Sam was leaning back, scrolling through his phone when Brian approached. "Hey," Brian said, sitting beside him. "Hey," Sam replied, not looking up. There was a long pause, filled only by the distant shouts of kids playing. "I owe you an apology," Brian said finally. "Probably more than one." Sam glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "For what?" "For being a crap friend," Brian admitted. "For bailing on plans, for snapping at you when I was in a mood, for everything." Sam smirked. "Well, you're not wrong." Brian let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I guess not. But seriously, I'm trying to do better. I know I've said it before, but this time I mean it." Sam studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but I'm holding you to it this time. No more excuses." "Deal," Brian said, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. At home, the family slowly began to establish new routines. His parents set firm but fair boundaries. He was expected to contribute to chores, stick to a budget, and actively work toward his goals. At first, it was tough. Brian bristled at the new rules, but over time, he began to see the benefit. He learned to cook simple meals, kept his room tidy, mostly, and started taking small steps toward independence. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, his mum smiled at him. "You've been doing well, Brian. We're proud of you." His dad grunted in agreement. "Keep it up, mate." For the first time in years, Brian felt a flicker of pride in himself. Not for being perfect, but for being normal, for trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 12. A New Opportunity. The Help Wanted sign in the cafe window caught Brian's eye as he walked through town. The place wasn't fancy, just a small, locally owned cafe with mismatched chairs and chalkboard menus, but something about it felt approachable, almost inviting. He hesitated at the door, fiddling with the strap of his backpack. This was the 5th time he'd walked past the place this week, and every time he'd told himself he wasn't ready. But today, something was different. "Stuff it," he muttered to himself, stepping inside. The warm aroma of coffee and baked goods enveloped him as he approached the counter. A woman in her 50s with a kind face and an apron dusted in flour looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yeah, I saw the sign." Brian said, pointing awkwardly at the door. "Are you still looking for someone?" Her eyes lit up. "We are. I'm Kate, the owner. Do you have any cafe experience?" "Not really," Brian admitted, "but I'm a quick learner and I'm good with people." Kate chuckled. "Well, we'll see about that. Why don't you come in tomorrow for a trial shift?" Brian's heart raced, a mix of excitement and nerves. "Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks." The next day, Brian found himself behind the counter, learning how to work the till and make basic drinks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was straightforward enough to feel manageable. Of course, there were hiccups. His first latte looked more like a milkshake, and he accidentally rang up a cappuccino as a bagel. But Kate was patient, offering guidance without judgment. "You're doing fine," she said as he wiped down a table for the third time. "Just remember, everyone starts somewhere." Over the weeks, Brian began to settle into the rhythm of the cafe. He discovered he liked chatting with customers, even if he occasionally tripped over his words or forgot an order. His co-workers were a small, friendly group who quickly picked up on his quirks and helped him stay on track. One particularly busy afternoon, as Brian scrambled to keep up with a flood of orders, he caught himself laughing. Not a nervous, self-deprecating laugh, but a genuine one. It felt good. The real turning point came one evening when Alison video called him. He'd just finished his shift and was sitting on the couch, still in his flour-dusted uniform. "You look tired," she teased. "I am," he admitted with a grin. "But it's a good tired, you know?" They talked about his day, about the customer who tipped him $20 for being a legend, and the co-worker who'd taught him how to make latte art. "You sound happy," Alison said after a pause. Brian hesitated. "I think I am. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but it's something, and for the first time, I don't feel like I'm faking it." Alison smiled. That's all anyone can ask for. As the months went on, Brian started to see progress, not just at work, but in himself. He was still forgetful, still impulsive at times, but he was learning to manage it. He even began saving a little money, dreaming of the day he could afford his own place. One sunny afternoon, as he stood at the cafe counter watching the world go by, Kate nudged him. "You're doing all right, Brian," she said. He smiled, a quiet but genuine pride blooming in his chest. For the first time in years, Brian didn't feel like he was waiting for his life to start. He was living it, one step at a time, one day at a time. And that was enough. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Brian's story. Whether you're navigating ADHD yourself or supporting someone who is, I hope this journey offered a sense of connection and understanding. Remember, every step forward, no matter how small, is a step worth celebrating. Wishing you strength, patience, and kindness on your own journey. Take care, and know you're not alone.